Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This was part of my wrestling anthology series, looking at that crazy world. This episode is myself and Pat Mullin talking about the little promotion that could, ECW, Eastern Championship Wrestling first and later Extreme Championship Wrestling. And as a it's hard to appropriately understand ECW's impact. Um, Here's maybe the most appropriate thing I can say about it. If you want to understand how important it was to the world of professional wrestling at the time when it came about, the impact it still had is could be summarized as Tommy Dreamer has been an ECW nostalgia act at this point longer than ECW was in business. And that's still a thing that's going on. It was an important promotion. There's not really another way to phrase that. It was very important. And as all good wrestling promotions have, there's a number of incredible villains and incredible personalities that you just want to see get destroyed. And ECW had quite a few. You had the Sandman at a couple of different points lean a little bit heelish. Sabu was nuts, deliberately nuts. Sabu getting booked in AEW in 2023, by the way. Good for him, I guess. Uh, Raven would be one of the big ones. Mick Foley had a tremendous heel run in ECW for a while. Uh, don't know if we talk a little bit about Don Callis. I believe the then known as his on-screen character was Cyrus the Virus. Another guy still getting gigs in 2023. So this is myself and Pat talking about all the craziness that happened over there in ECW for the time for its existence. So thank you very much for listening. Always appreciate it. Anything you can do to support the show, like, comment, subscribe, share, tell a friend, star rating, written review, whatever is applicable to your podcast platform of choice. Thank you very much. I'll throw it to my past self and to everyone else. Thank you for listening again, and I hope you enjoy the show.
When the devil is too busy and death's a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pebble in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wiggle and writhe. And it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me. I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, I am back. That's right, I took a few weeks off of this show. Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. Once I was doing coverage on a Friday night because for some reason the UFC decided that would be a good time for an event. I was sick last week, but this week, no. Even with, strained muscles in my back, because digging a grave with just a couple of shovels, not advisable. Just throw that out there. Use that how you will, everybody. But I'm here. I was not going to let myself go another week without doing this, because I like this too darn much. I'm Robert Winfree, and again, this is Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. Thank you all so very much for joining us for this one. My last show, again, a couple of weeks ago, I deviated from the professional wrestling landscape. I had an opening. I Gavin Napier from the Casual Heroes came on. We talked about Breaking Bad because it's awesome, one of the best shows ever. But now we're going back into the world of professional wrestling because I was doing that for a while and I want to keep going. Up this week, everyone's favorite little, bingo hall, blood and guts promotion, Extreme Championship Wrestling, based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And there was only one guy I could get to come on and talk about this, a man so East Coast, I don't have a joke. I wish I did, but I don't. He's just my East Coast representative, holds things down in that particular part of the world as far as the Radlichen Broadcasting Network goes. Welcome back, everyone. Pat Mullin, he was here earlier for the Territory podcast. Pat, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Robert. And just so people know, my hiatus was not based on not having a platform where I get the proper respect. Shout out to Vanderlei Silva.
Oh, Vandy, you poor guy. Of course, is it just me or is the Nevada State Athletic Commission just full of... we joke about Clucky in the MMA circles, but now they're postponing another hearing based on him running from a random drug test. I mean, I don't know. It's a trying sport. But we're not talking about MMA. We're talking about ECW, this little promotion out of the Northeast that completely altered the landscape of professional wrestling. Now, I'm not going to say Paul Heyman is a genius for doing that. I believe what he did was inevitable. Whenever you have too much of one style of something, music, professional wrestling, books, movies, so on and so forth, you're going to get something that goes just completely the opposite direction and changes everything. Star Wars completely changed the tenor of movies after the gritty, depressing realism, blood and guts of the 60s and early 70s. And Nirvana changed music, and ECW changed professional wrestling. It was inevitable, which is not to detract from it. But Pat, I assume you were kind of aware of ECW, not since maybe their beginning days, but for most of the promotion's run, you were aware of their existence, yes?
Yeah, living in the Northeast, ECW, when it became Extreme Championship Wrestling, got a syndicated spot on the MSG network, the Madison Square Garden cable channel, that was available in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and certain parts of Pennsylvania on Saturday night / Sunday morning at 1 a.m. And so, granted, you had to make kind of an effort to stay up and catch the show that was eventually called Hardcore TV, but that was where, in about mid-1994, I caught on when MSG, I think, first started showing it. I used to stay up late with my dad on the weekends anyway, and we'd watch a movie or something, and then one weekend we just so happened to be channel surfing and seeing what's on MSG, if it's a rerun of the game or a boxing match, and it just so happened it was wrestling, and wrestling we hadn't seen, and there were some familiar names on there, and we're like, oh, let's take a look, and we saw guys like Too Cold Scorpio, who had recently had a run in WCW, who I was a big fan of, and names like Shane Douglas, who had been in both the WCW and WWE, and some guys I'd never heard of but was extremely intrigued when I saw them, like Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko and The Sandman. And so I became an ECW viewer in 1994 and pretty much stayed with it through its dying days in 2001.
All right, well, you brought up Shane Douglas, and since this is my show, Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, and we talk about the great villains and how they kind of, their impact, and we look at things from that perspective. When Paul Heyman launched ECW, again, the famous kind of jumping off point was Shane Douglas becomes the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, beats Too Cold Scorpio in the finals, throws down the belt, declares it a relic of bygone eras, part of a broken organization, hoists the ECW Regional Championship, which he held at the time, and declared it the ECW World Championship. And he was moving forward into the new generation. This subsequently got ECW removed from the NWA because Paul Heyman played if you listen to some of the documentaries, some really interesting political maneuvering from Paul Heyman as far as that went. In another life, the guy would have been a politician. And we're off and running with Shane Douglas as your franchise player, your heavyweight champion, and he's just grossly antagonistic towards everyone, and he's very good at being loud and obnoxious and getting everyone to hate him. And he was paired with Francine right around that time, wasn't he? Or am I getting my time frames mixed up?
Not initially. He got paired up with Francine a little bit later on at the time, but Shane kind of initially was actually with Sherry Martel, for a very brief time when they relaunched ECW's Extreme Championship Wrestling. But Sherry didn't last. Sherry wound up in WCW shortly thereafter.
All right, now you were a fan, and it's not. Again, I'm not deeply emotionally invested in ECW or the memory thereof. There was some good stuff. There was some questionable stuff. There's a bunch of stuff that people remember with rose-colored glasses, and for some reason that bothers me even when I do it. But Shane Douglas is a heel. What was it about him and his character that made him so effective from your perspective?
Shane was a guy who was mad at everybody. He was mad at WCW, where he felt he didn't get a fair shake. He was mad at his initial run in WWE, which took place in 1990, 1991. And then, of course, again in 1995 when they rechristened him as Dean Douglas and gave him, kind of the teacher gimmick. And he was pissed off about that because he felt he was held back by Shawn Michaels and the Clique. He felt Ric Flair did everything he could to hold back younger talent in WCW and was a principal reason for why his contract was not renewed or it was attempted to be renewed, but at a much lower pay rate than what he felt he was worth. Shane had angst towards seemingly everybody in the wrestling business in one of the big two companies, and that just poured out onto the screen and got to the point where even if he was justified, the fact that he wouldn't shut up about it is what really got you mad about it. And that was where Shane really initially found his niche as a heel, this guy who would just complain about anything and refuses to not be heard by everybody. He just was mad at everything and wasn't going to take it anymore and got pushed over the edge where instead of doing the right thing about it and maybe filing a grievance and going on about his business, he was going to remind everybody how the system tried to hold him down and he's better than everybody else who they've done it to because he broke through and now he's the ECW champion and everybody else can go, stick it where. And that passion was very much the real Shane, and that's why it poured through so well into his character.
He was and now Paul Heyman and Todd Gordon, who have both gone on record, Shane Douglas was deliberately the guy they were going to build around. I think famously Terry Funk and Sabu had their three-way dance, that kind of promotion a bit more on the map. I mean, you had Shane Douglas throw down the NWA title, and you got people's attention, and then you had, I think not too long later, though, again, my timeline might be off here, you had those three guys go on and have just a heck of a wrestling match, which is, and that's an odd combination when you consider the parties involved of, Shane Douglas, Terry Funk, and Sabu, but they meshed so well as far as what they could present to the fans from an in-ring perspective. So, Shane Douglas, the right guy to build around, especially early on?
Yeah, and if you want a symbolic, kind of a symbolic moment of why he was the right guy, in that three-way dance that went an hour to the time limit, the only guy who actually wrestled for all 60 minutes of that match was Shane. Shane started off the match with Terry Funk and Sabu, and they did an injury thing where Terry got knocked out of the match for 15 minutes. Then they did a thing later on towards the end where Sabu was incapacitated for 15 minutes. So each of them wrestled 45 minutes, but Shane was in the match the whole time for that 60 minutes. And I think that one gesture more than anything really showed you that, okay, Shane is very much capable of carrying things in the ring, which is what you need out of a top guy, but he's also got this personality, this antagonism, this notoriety that's going to be great to build around, and that was why they went with him. And if you look at the other choices they had at the time, there were guys who were not necessarily fully committed to ECW. Terry was still doing things with WCW at the time. Sabu, while an incredible attraction, was not the in-ring performer that Shane was, and was a guy who needed that.
I was going to say, Sabu was also making most of his money in Japan with FMW at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was working FMW and a lot of the other shows in Japan that would book him, and still doing independents in the United States as well, besides ECW. So not a guy who necessarily was going to be your franchise player. They had names like Ron Simmons and some other guys, but you weren't sure whether or not they were using ECW as kind of a transitional period until they got picked up by a major company, which was true of a lot of people. And Shane was, he had his short little run where he was initially their guy, and then he went back to the WWF, and he hated it, left almost as soon as he came in, and was back, and there wasn't any danger of him really doing that again at that point, because both companies had personnel that were so fed up with Shane and vice versa that he was going to be a reliable guy for you.
All right, the other thing I want to mention with Shane Douglas, we kind of touched on let me get your perspective. His pairing with Francine, because you mentioned he was with Sherry Martel for a little bit. He and Francine had a decent run together. What did she add to the presentation? I haven't seen a lot of his stuff when the two of them were paired on screen. So what did she add to his overall presentation?
You know, Shane's nickname became the Franchise, and it was really apt because he was for a long time the franchise player of ECW. Shane at this point in time had cooled down a little bit as the heel, the alpha heel, I should say, and another guy had stepped in who I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But they needed to do something with Shane, and Shane had this idea of he had injured Gary Wolf, Pitbull 1, and
yep.
Francine was the manager of the Pitbulls at the time. The injury was accidental, so what they decided to do was go further with it. And they had Francine turn on the Pitbulls. Pitbull 2 was holding the ECW TV title at the time, and go with Shane because the Pitbulls were beloved by ECW fans, the original Mad Dogs of War. They were really over. Francine being with them added to their presentation because you had the hot girl with them that drew even more attention to them and dressed her up slutty and had her carry them out with chains for the whole Generation X presentation. And then Francine going with Shane just gave people more of a reason to hate Shane at that point because he convinced her to turn on them. And then he had a willing accomplice who could bring even more heat because she would cheat for him. She would do things in that nature. And, you know, it just made you even more pissed off because Shane was such a good heel, and he'd always have this shit-eating grin on his face and get away with seemingly everything. He took Pitbull 1 by the halo brace that he was in at the time and jerked him around and threw him. He literally had to fight his way through the audience to get out of the arena. And Francine, a major part of that. And the thing about that was Francine was involved in that too, but she knew enough how to generate the heat, but let Shane do the main dirty work where everything is still on him. She was just doing the right thing to bolster that heat and get it nuclear for Shane, which is what works so well.
I wanted to talk about the Pitbull number 1, Gary Wolf, getting his neck broken. Now, I don't want to go in too much into actually what happened. Gary Wolf still blames Shane Douglas, to the best of my knowledge. Douglas maintains Gary didn't protect himself properly. But while he was out with that broken neck, they had a big series of vignettes that they would run with Shane doing all of these things that, you know, he can do because his neck's not broken, running a marathon, swimming, all these things that now poor Gary Wolf, who has to sit at home, like you said, in a halo brace, can't do. Then when he gets in the ring, Shane yanks him around. I mean, those guys, you know, again, the fans getting so incensed that they actually jumped the rail to get at Shane Douglas for that. That's the last time I can really remember someone having that much heat with an audience that they were just like, okay, no, screw this, screw the barriers, no, I wish to now physically harm you. Which is just a whole part of wrestling that is lost in contemporary professional wrestling. Again, I don't think too many people in either TNA or the WWE right now have any form of legitimate heat. You have people who boo you, but you don't have any deep emotional reaction all that much. And here's a guy who got people to actually jump the barricades to try and get at him. I think, to my knowledge, that's the last time you had a full-scale near riot in American professional wrestling. Any other incidents come to your mind that happened after that one?
I mean, to that extent where you had people bloodthirsty, really ready to go after the guy, I can't really think of any coming to mind immediately, so that's probably a no. I mean, you've had heels generate heat, but really nothing I can remember to that extent. Where, you know, and then ECW was very good at blurring the lines between reality and the show because of their rabid fan base who was so passionate. And so it was very easy to manipulate that crowd, but also get a workable angle out of it. And I can't think of anything that really got that kind of response from people in North American wrestling, at least before or since then.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I think Japanese wrestling is different in just the crowd. Whenever you get a Japanese crowd legitimately hot, they will do crazy stuff. I mean, Vader tells stories about being pelted with, flaming pillows, which is not as fun as its type of thing. But North American wrestling, it's an odd duck as far as crowd reactions go. But yeah, that was the main thing with Douglas that I wanted to talk about, was the fact that he got that crowd, which which prides itself on being smart, so angry that they turned back into what you used to get from, pardon the potentially derogatory term, but you got from the half-drunk rednecks back in the territory days. And he turned all of these, nowadays they'd be, just kind of the smart, the internet wrestling community snarky smart marks, and he got them to just fully believe in the show again. And I mean, incidentally, the ultimate victory I feel for any performer is to make people forget that what they're watching is fake, or to still elicit that kind of a reaction. But any other kind of seminal moments from Shane Douglas's run in ECW? Because I'm as big a part as he was for their early success, he seemed to kind of fade once other characters started really hitting their stride.
He was pushed more to the back burner, and I do think part of it was a little bit of punishment for kind of going to the WWE after proclaiming his hatred for WCW and big-time wrestling, and I think that was always kind of in the back of the mind of Paul Heyman when dealing with Shane. I think that was part of it, but Shane as a whole just was a very consistent performer for ECW who could easily slide into a main event scenario. Because of all the things he was willing to do, that heat was just always retained. He never worked as a babyface in ECW until the very end of his ECW run, when it was kind of forced at that point, because he got to a point with the audience where he was just so consistent with them and had been part of that product that they had seen from the very get-go, that they just eventually didn't really want to boo Shane anymore. But his running of the Triple Threat faction, with the lineups being probably the most remembered being himself, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Chris Candido, and using them to manipulate the World Heavyweight Championship that culminated eventually in a short run against Bigelow, manipulated by Rick Rude, and his long drawn-out program that eventually built to him and Taz, and finally putting the belt on Taz in ECW, where Shane was really underscored in that whole program, because he was the guy really working to get Taz over and hold things together and making Taz look like a monster, even though Taz was 5'8" and barely 240 pounds. Shane did a lot in that feud to really get Taz over, and it was at a very crucial time where the company was really trying to go national. So I think that says a lot about where Shane stood and what he had to offer as a performer, that he was the guy they knew could get Taz over to that next level to be the guy to carry the company.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Taz in a little bit, but the next guy I want to bring up here, this was an odd. There's a Paul Heyman quote. I want to talk about Raven because he was such an interesting character, and Paul Heyman said something about Raven that got me thinking about it. And again, I was not big into ECW when it was during its heyday, or even I've seen stuff after the fact. I never experienced it as it was happening. Paul Heyman said something interesting, particularly about Raven, in that the Raven character never received any cheers in ECW, despite, first of all, some of his claims potentially being valid, talking about, coming from a broken home and being angry at Tommy Dreamer for being, the stupid jock in high school, and all the other things that Raven said and did. Despite playing to a very, again, smart audience, no one ever cheered Raven. And I'm wondering, because I don't remember him having a face run in ECW. I mean, there was he and Tommy Dreamer were tag team champions for a brief moment, I think. But here was a guy who was never cheered when he wanted to be booed. And it's an odd thing to think that that's something notable in a professional wrestler's career. But by the same token, when you're playing to that kind of an audience, especially in the time period of, the 90s to the very early, to the year 2000, give or take, with the Raven character, no one ever cheered him. I mean, that to me is a fascinating compliment to Scott Levy, the guy who portrayed Raven, and his ability to manipulate a crowd, and his delivery, most importantly, because in other circumstances, everything he's saying could be viewed as maybe trying to get fire as a babyface instead of get heat as a heel. So I'm curious as to your perspective, Raven never being cheered. I mean, is Paul Heyman inaccurate in that? He's been inaccurate. There's some revisionist history from time to time from Mr. Heyman, the Advocate. But to the best of my knowledge, that's an accurate statement. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, Raven just that effective at making people dislike him?
Yes, I'm not going to say he never drew cheers, because there was always a sect of the audience that was always the smart group, and they loved Raven, loved what Raven did. But I'll say that the vast majority of the audience in ECW despised and booed and never cheered Raven. And nor should they have, because Raven was a brilliant heel. Raven, every promoter has a character that they really throw themselves into and would have envisioned for themselves in a certain context. For Vince McMahon, for a long time, everybody pointed out that the Ted DiBiase character was that for him. For Bill Watts, it was Steve Dr. Death Williams. For Paul Heyman, that character was clearly Raven. And Paul was willing to push that character to the moon. And it really culminates with Raven being in a rivalry with Tommy Dreamer, his arch rival, and the fact that they never let Tommy beat Raven in over 2 years. Never one time. And all the times they wrestled each other in singles matches, tag team matches, had a fight in any scenario, Tommy never won until the very, very end. And even in feuds with other characters like the Sandman, who had been turned babyface by the audience, Raven always seemingly had the upper hand, no matter what means it went to. And it went to some extreme ones, like the involvement of Sandman's son and family. And, with Tommy using his ex-girlfriend, and then eventually the pregnancy angle and everything you could think of to do to an extreme, no pun intended, level with a character. That's what Raven allowed Paul Heyman to do. And a lot of those ideas were from Scott Levy, who portrayed Raven himself, and Paul Heyman just giving him that creative freedom and saying, yeah, I like that idea. That's brilliant. Let's run with it.
Let me ask you this. Another thing that has been brought up, and I think Paul Heyman has brought it up as well as other people, that Scott Levy as a person is diametrically opposed to Raven as a character. Is that accurate? I mean, is that because I've not seen any of his shoot interviews or all of that fun stuff. My exposure to Raven is just Raven, the on-screen character, and I mean, I'm aware that he was also, Johnny Polo and all that fun stuff. But from what you've seen, that's an incredible ability to kind of put himself in a completely different headspace if he is, as a person, so very different from Raven.
Yeah, it is. It is. And to really get into that character to the depths and the level they did, I was always intrigued, even as a viewer then when I was younger, that they could really delve that deep and get that creative, because these were things you never saw before. And really, you may have seen certain things taken from these angles since, but they're in companies where you can't go the full Monty because, for example, the World Wrestling Entertainment, it's a publicly traded company. WCW is owned by Turner and eventually AOL Time Warner. Not a company you could do those things with, obviously. And so when you have a creative genius who's allowed that creative freedom, and not necessarily with the entire show, but with himself, it speaks volumes about what he can do with that direction. And we saw Scott Levy and Paul Heyman each put themselves into that character, and the success it maintained was incredible.
Is Raven for you kind of one of the, if not then one of the top three or so definitive names associated with ECW?
I would say yes. I definitely think Raven is one of those guys who, when you think ECW, I think Raven's got to be one of the three guys who comes to mind if you're building an ECW Mount Rushmore, so to speak.
Yeah.
And even from a creative perspective, he created so many other characters in that company.
Well, he was indirectly kind of responsible for the BWO because he had his cronies, Steven Richards and Blue Meanie, and he would, on a weekly basis, have them do stupid stuff that amused him. He had them come out as Baron von Raschke and a guy at one point, and Stevie with the horrible bald cap, and just odd stuff like that Raven did essentially to amuse himself, and the audience got over with the audience because it was fun. And Meanie at one point says, well, the New World Order is running wild over in WCW. We could be the Blue World Order. And comedic gold was born. I mean, there was nothing close to that. after that, and I'm just as a brief aside, those guys, it was what, Nova, Steven Richards, and the Meanie. Those guys had to just have been having so much fun for 90% of the time with what they were doing. I mean,
you would think so, because like you said, it started as that, Raven telling them to entertain him in some way. So they would do Baron Von Stevie, or they'd have Meanie come out with Stevie as the Fabulous Ones, doing the strut, and or whatever, and then dressing up as Kiss and playing as Kiss. And then you finally, like, when the BW idea came about, that gave Meanie and Stevie and eventually Nova, who was factored into the group, the freedom to kind of run with their stuff and get goofy. And it got Stevie over to the point where he was actually in the main event of the first ECW pay-per-view.
The moonsault from Terry Funk, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
God. Terry Funk, 60 years old with no knees, decides he wants to moonsault. That man is crazy.
Hey, you going to tell Terry Funk now?
I probably would, and I'd run like hell, but I'd probably tell him. And by the same token, God love him for, because we need people who are a little crazy in this world.
Yeah, and you know what? One of the other gimmicks Raven is responsible for, the Dudley Boys.
Oh God, those big old meatheads.
Raven was actually the creator of that gimmick because he had been watching, and I don't know if you've seen it, but I know some of our listeners have, and I have, and I love it, the movie Slapshot. The hockey film starring Paul Newman, and in the movie there's a brother group called the Hanson Brothers. Yeah. And they wore the Dudley glasses, and every talk to them, what are you doing? Putting my foils on, coach. And there was these ridiculous sort of inbred type brothers, characters, and Raven wanted to do something like that in ECW, so he came up with the Dudley Boys. And there was at first, there was Bubba Ray Dudley, and Bubba had a stutter and loved to dance. And then there was Big Dick Dudley, who was the monster enforcer of the group. And the characters got progressively weirder with dances with Dudley, who was the Native American Dudley. Sign Guy Dudley, who Raven eventually recreated as Lodi in WCW. What other Dudley? Devon, obviously, who is the Black Dudley. Little Spike Dudley, whose initials, not coincidentally, spelled out LSD. And Dudley, who was the sane brother, and all these great characters that spawned out of Raven's mind.
Whatever he was on at the time must have been pretty awesome. Let's talk for a little bit about the Dudleys. They really, I feel, this is an odd thing, but I feel they hit their in-ring stride once they actually got to the then World Wrestling Federation, and they were paired up with, they were part of the Tag Team Revolution and all the great stuff that came out of the WWE at that point in time. But I feel like they had to raise their in-ring game when they got to the World Wrestling Federation, because a lot of what they did in ECW was just talking all kinds of smack to the live crowd to get them riled up. Not necessarily with microphones, just standing in the ring, calling people out, insulting them, and I mean, it's a great thing, but that's something you can't do in, again, the World Wrestling Federation. You couldn't say the things they were saying, which were not nice things.
No, and they were willing to say anything to generate heat, and that's one of the things that allowed people in ECW to get over that they may not have necessarily been able to do had they started somewhere else. In ECW, you had that free reign to say what you wanted and mean what you say and say what you mean, and the things they said to audiences would not have been allowed anywhere else, but they were clearly allowed there, and it got to the point where you had audience members spitting at them, taking swings at them, and them, giving it right back. And to be willing to go that far, not a lot of people are, even in that scenario in ECW where you can pretty much do what you want. But a lot of people would stop at a line, and Bubba and Devon particularly were guys who were, we're not going to draw a line. We're going to do everything we can to get over and get paid.
Among their other colorful insults, didn't they accuse various audience members that their fathers were sodomized by their father, Big John, the Father Dudley in
Big
prison?
Daddy Dudley.
Yeah, he used to have his way.
I believe one of the ones I heard during a live show that RF Video put on tape was something like, Big Daddy Dudley used to fuck guys like you in prison. It was the line they threw at somebody. And then they had, they would just, at a pay-per-view in, I believe it was, it might have been in Cleveland, Ohio, or somewhere there, they're calling out various audience members, and they point to a fag in a Hawaiian shirt and a mother who taught her daughter how to suck dick.
Oh, God, those guys. You know, you mentioned it. Even when you can say anything like you could theoretically in ECW, there's a line that most people will just kind of hang behind, and those guys barreled right over it. I mean, and to be fair, you know, I mentioned they hit their in-ring peak in WWE. I maintain that. But the fact that they were able to kind of transfer what they were, the successful elements of their gimmick from ECW over to WWE, and the fact that they raised their in-ring game to compensate for what they couldn't do verbally necessarily. I mean, those two guys, Bubba Ray and Devon in particular, one of the, if not the greatest tag teams of all time, just based on hardware, longevity, the fact that they could still, today, go out and tag team as the Dudleys or as Team 3D or what have you, and draw a crowd. It speaks a lot to what those two were able to accomplish and what they were allowed to do, and again, the breeding ground for talent that ECW had.
Yeah, and Bubba himself has said that, you know, there came a point in time where he understood that ECW was the minor league and the breeding ground for, you know, the big league, WWE. And you saw them kind of mature after they had their initial outings against Farouk and Bradshaw, where they proved their toughness, they proved they could take a beating and stay, and then they went ahead and they were wrestling finesse teams like Edge and Christian, like the Hardys, and the various other teams at the time, and they couldn't rely on cheap heat anymore like they did. They couldn't rely on ultra-violence until they got into the TLC matches, which didn't happen overnight. It took a few months for that to go through. They wanted to make sure these guys were capable, and you saw them have better matches as they went on, because in ECW they never really had the foundation that they would have needed to succeed in ring in WWE as a tag team. And it's arguable that because they eventually got it, and WWE did have investment in their tag teams at the time, that was the last particularly good era of WWE tag team wrestling.
I would not argue with that at all. I mean, there was a time when Paul Heyman was booking SmackDown when you would get some really good tag team matches, but you didn't necessarily have established and long-term tag teams like you did with the Hardys, Edge and Christian, the Dudleys, and you could toss in, again, the Brothers of Destruction with Kane and The Undertaker. The Acolytes could be plugged in to that group. You had actual tag team wrestling and a good division, and that hasn't been seen since. Right, the other, I really want to get into Cactus Jack and his time in ECW because, first of all, I'm a pretty big fan of Mick Foley for a variety of reasons, but his tenure in ECW, he was an interesting kind of piece in the promotional machine, even though ECW not a machine in the traditional sense. But his kind of cog in the wheel was he had some name value. He went there after a pretty good stint in WCW, including some brutal matches with Vader. Again, assuming my timeline is not being jumbled around in my head again. So he brought a little bit more of the, a little notoriety, a little bit of, oh, I remember him. He fought Sting. And his anti-hardcore stuff, which is kind of what everyone remembers him for from that. I mean, he had some good matches. He had some stuff with Sabu. He had some fun stuff with the Sandman. But when he got in front of the camera and lambasted the ECW fans for their desire for blood and the people who were killing themselves with that style of wrestling, I mean, he just basically pointed out the truth about the ECW fans. And naturally speaking, when you tell someone the truth, they tend to dislike you for it. And his whole presentation with the kind of Charles Manson pitch to his voice, and it got higher in tone. He sounded a little crazy, but everything he said made sense and, objectively speaking, was true. And his stuff with, telling Tommy Dreamer, don't do this, you're killing yourself, take the money from Eric Bischoff, and I speak from experience here, and he was kind of siding with Raven there. I mean, those promos from Mick Foley are some of the best ever, especially when you limit them to solo promos. I mean, if you want to add in dueling stuff, that's a whole other category. If you're talking about just one guy alone with a camera, more or less, they're some of the best ever. I mean, Mick Foley tapped into something with the fans and with himself that really resonated. I mean, those hold up, all these years later. I mean, I know of some teachers who use those promos as an example of dramatic monologue in like acting classes and whatnot. So Mick Foley as Cactus Jack being anti-hardcore and anti-ECW. I mean, are there superlatives enough to really kind of to go over that?
I don't know, because it was so ahead of its time in thought process, and all credit to Mick for that. And Mick's always been one of the best interviews that there is. Those promos, really more than anything, were Mick being able to cut loose and voice opinions that were genuinely his, and do so in a forum where taking one perspective of the company could lead you to becoming its most reviled villain. And Mick, said this was all set off by one night he happened to be wrestling, and somebody, a smart mark of some kind, held up a sign that said Kane Dewey in reference to Mick's newborn son. And like anybody, Mick was extremely pissed when he saw that sign, felt there was absolutely no reason for it, and that's where Mick really drew the inspiration for these promos and taking this route. And of all people to speak out against the hardcore style of wrestling, you have the man most associated with it in terms of anybody, Mick Foley. And in addition to those incredible promos, which resonated because any chance Paul Heyman got, they were telling you that Eric Bischoff and WCW were the bad guys. Shane Douglas was telling you about how WCW doesn't care about you. They give you what they want, not what you want, and tell you that it's what you want. And the constant crusading against Eric Bischoff. And Foley comes out and he cuts these promos talking about how good Eric Bischoff is, how he offers you this money and you don't have to kill yourself and throw yourself through tables and be beaten with chairs every night, and that these fans who support that don't care about you. They're like the people in the Roman arenas watching the gladiator fight the lion, hoping one of them dies and not caring which. It was amazing.
I believe one of his lines was, "They wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire."
Yeah, and then he goes even further with it in his matches, where it comes a point in the match where you think he's really going to rev up and do something Cactus Jack-esque, and instead he ties on a rear chin lock or a hammer lock and brings it back to mat wrestling just to infuriate the fans. And he orchestrated it so well. And one of the great moments during that feud is he's fighting with Tommy Dreamer in a match, and Tommy, he's wearing a T-shirt with the Dungeon of Doom, which was a very cartoony gimmick that WCW was doing of various heels allying themselves against Hulk Hogan, led by Kevin Sullivan. And you had some really kind of cartoony passe gimmicks at the time, like Kamala, John Tenta, who was best known as Earthquake, as the Shark, Brutus Beefcake as the Zodiac Man. And he had all of them airbrushed on a T-shirt, and Tommy rips it off of him, and you see this T-shirt on that he has, and it's a big mural of Eric Bischoff, and the back says, "Take me back, Uncle Eric," and the crowd just gets so pissed, and they cheered rabidly when Tommy pulls Bischoff's face on the shirt up over Mick's face and just starts punching away at him. It was so smart. Mick is one of the probably 5 smartest individuals that ever came into the wrestling business, and that whole heel run just exemplifies it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had forgotten that he would refuse to wrestle that style and would just decide, no, we'll have a hammerlock or a chin lock here, and just to further incite the crowd. Oh, I forgot. That was glorious. God, Mick Foley, that poor guy. The fact that most of what he said came true. I mean, the fact that he nowadays, his knees are shot, Tommy Dreamer's got, a broken back and all that fun. I mean, the fact that there was to what he was saying, and, 10 years on, we're now seeing the full-on effects of the people who bought into that style of wrestling all the time. Just like you said, one of the smartest guys ever in the history of professional wrestling. All right, I want to move on kind of towards the waning years of ECW, and I want to talk about Taz a little bit, because Taz was, in so many ways, actually pretty great. I mean, less than 6 feet tall, had, skin complexion that on TV might read orange, but when he was in the ring, you believed he was throwing guys on their head and not caring how they landed. And I'm curious, this is an odd thing, but referee Bill Alfonso, is it just me, or did he have some of the most heat of anyone in ECW at any given point in time?
It's arguable that Fonzie at one point in time generated more heat than anybody ever did in ECW. That man was so hated, and it was a perfect gimmick because he had been very visible as a referee in both WCW when it was the NWA and the WWF. I mean, he's very visible during WrestleMania 9 throughout the show because he happened to be Giant Gonzalez's kind of handler in real life. And so him being that character and them going with it, because you had done the evil referee before with Danny Davis in the WWF and Teddy Long in the NWA and all the way back to John Foley in Stampede Wrestling. But this was different because Bill Alfonso was coming in and establishing rules and regulations where in a promotion where they weren't supposed to have any place. So he's ruling disqualifications, and through a contractual loophole, they can't do anything to fire him. And so his rulings on matches are final. Tommy Dreamer finally got a pinfall over Raven. No, Bill Alfonso's there to rule that he wasn't the legal man and it doesn't count. And just, man, you wanted to see this guy get his. And just never happened till he had a one-on-one match with Beulah McGillicuddy. Fonzie coming in and not just trying to establish rules, which were the antithesis of what ECW is founded on, but also proudly wearing the WWF Raw hat and carrying the flag for Monday Night Raw, and hating everything about ECW. And the whistle. God. Think about how annoying Jimmy Hart's megaphone was and amplified about 10 times because he's not even saying anything. He's just blowing a rape whistle.
I didn't think you could get more aggravating than Jimmy Hart's megaphone, but no, there's Bill Alfonso with the whistle. And he's out there shilling for, again, guys like Taz, guys like Rob Van Dam. But I wanted to, again, go to Taz for a little bit here because there was a guy who, even in his promos, came across as so, I mean, his FTW promo where he tears down, I believe it was The Rock and Hulk Hogan, who were the champions of WWF and WCW at the time. A really good bit of promo work, and again, his in-ring presentation as, you know, one of the, as you know, the legitimate fighter who will throw you on your head and then choke you out. Just a really interesting presentation of a character.
Yeah, Taz's whole redefined gimmick after he had done kind of the Savage Tasmaniac thing and eventually, you know, got over the neck injury and everything and came back, reinvented as kind of a forerunner to an MMA gimmick as a no-holds-barred shoot fighter, which they would refer to him. And this just mean, surly guy who didn't care about anyone or anything other than getting his hands on Sabu and beating Sabu. And he just was, his gimmick was that Taz was a miserable bastard who just so happened to be really good at fighting despite his size, despite everything seemingly working against him. He wanted to hurt somebody, and he didn't care who and how. He was just going to do it. And pairing him with Bill Alfonso was the way that you kept him from becoming a babyface, because that's a really easy gimmick to get behind if he destroys people at will. And there's not anyone who could do anything about it, and it's not like he's a big, overpowering bully. He's a small guy with a bully mentality. So it could be really easy for people to get into that. But what they did was they paired him with Fonzie. And by pairing him with Fonzie, they were able to keep people upset with him and angry at him and wanting to see him get his comeuppance eventually, hopefully from Sabu. And then, of course, when they realized that eventually this Taz character is too hot, we have to run with him, they made the switch and had Fonzie turn on Taz and align himself with Sabu, the same way that, you know, the WWF did with Mr. Fuji turning on Demolition, who were really hot, and joining forces with the Powers of Pain, who were not getting over.
And Taz as a heel was so good because, again, here's a guy who, because of his presentation and what everyone was willing to do, I mean, again, less than 6 feet tall, shorter than I am by a good 3 inches, somewhere between 3 and 4 inches, and he's just, but in that, in the ring, he would throw people. I mean, he threw Bam Bam Bigelow around a few times, and Bam Bam's a big guy, and he just had that killer presentation of, maybe I'm not the biggest, but if you're in the ring with me, I'm going to do everything in my power to harm you. Not beat you, I actually would like you to have to limp for the rest of your life because you decided to get in the ring with me.
And using a style that guys didn't use at the time, mixing in legitimate submission holds, the Taz mission, the Kaja Hajime from judo, a lot of judo throws, and a lot of legitimate martial arts movement and real Greco-Roman throws and suplexes. It made Taz different than everybody else because it seemed like he was more real.
Real briefly here, Taz's run in WWE, there's a rumor, and I don't know if this has been confirmed or debunked, but apparently after they signed Taz and brought him in, Vince McMahon took one look at that guy and almost killed everything they were going to do with him because of his physical stature. Now, Vince McMahon being who Vince McMahon is, to the best of our knowledge, that's not surprising at all. But do you feel that maybe he could have been more in, WWE than he was? Or was he just never going to get above kind of the hardcore division gimmick matches that he got once he got to that promotion?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Please finish.
No, that was it. I'm good.
Okay. A lot of ECW's success in 1999 was becoming a nationally recognized promotion, landing a contract with TNN to have a nationally broadcast show, added coverage in magazines and the media, a very large internet presence being a good majority of the wrestling audience at that time. I think people were really aware and excited about Taz, and he had so much momentum coming in, and that was retained in his first appearance when he was the first guy to beat Kurt Angle. I think that he could have been developed into more than he was for sure. I'm not saying he would have been a guaranteed long-term main event player, but I certainly think that a lot more could have been done with him than what was, which is ultimately nothing. He had one great shining moment in his debut in New York where everybody was familiar with him, where he beat Kurt Angle cleanly, Kurt Angle's first defeat, and had, again, a ton of momentum off that. But it seemed like the only reason after they signed him and their use of him was to hurt ECW. And it makes sense in a long strategic term because if you look at it, ECW signs a contract with TNN. Shortly thereafter, the WWF signs a contract with TNN with a long-standing understanding of that being the WWF told them to pick up ECW's show to show them it would do much better than anything else they had. They put them on a dead air time slot with no advertising, and sure enough, that was the case. But then, of course, they strip away Taz, they strip away the Dudley Boys, and take away the top stars, so the show doesn't have a chance of lasting anyway. And you see what happened.
They still did
but I
the
definitely
highest
think
rating
there was
from TNN at that point in
yeah,
time.
but I definitely think there was a lot more potential for Taz than what became, especially when he had the ECW title when WWE did them a favor and lent them Taz to take the belt from Mike Awesome. And instead, we got an unadvertised match between Taz and Triple H, champion versus champion, that did nothing to help ECW at all.
Right, you brought up Sabu there, and that there was a big push, especially going into ECW's first pay-per-view, which was going to be the first time meeting of Taz and Sabu. Sabu was an odd character in that his whole gimmick was he was crazy. I mean, he's a guy who would go out there and perform things that you had never seen before. You know, he's doing planchas, stuff with chairs like the triple jump moonsault or the Arabian facebuster, which is a leg drop off the top rope assisted with a chair. I mean, there's all these things that he's doing that are just crazy. And he even had a thing for a while where if a table was not broken in his match, after the match, he would then moonsault a table until it broke. He even did that in Japan for a little bit, I think, and the evil Japanese table got the better of Sabu on one occasion. Fans of Botchamania will get the reference. Because Japanese tables don't break. But Sabu is just this, kind of wild man from India who just is absolutely crazy and willing to perform all kinds of psychotic things like getting into a no-rope barbed wire match with Terry Funk. I mean, he's a character who it seemed like he wound up being cheered just because he was so crazy. Until, again, they paired him with Fonzie, who anyone got heat with because no one liked Fonzie.
There was nobody like Sabu at this point in time in wrestling. And as you said, his entire gimmick was that he was an uncontrollable madman. And he was going to just bring everything to a literal extreme. And that, of course, was predicated with the use of the tables, where he was going to break a table come hell or high water, even if he had to use his own body to do it. And that was the big appeal of Sabu, is this guy is legitimately crazy. You don't know what to expect with him. And how can you book a guy like that as anything other than a heel to start with, where he doesn't speak English, they had the great thing where his initial ECW theme music was the theme from Jaws, where he was brought out chained to this gurney with a Hannibal Lecter face mask and looked like he would do nothing but fight somebody until one of them was dead. And it was a great presentation, and the performer was absolutely mad enough to go with it and try to pull it off, and did. And eventually, the thing with Sabu, what happened, it was similar to Taz's scenario, where eventually that style, if you don't put a heater with them, and by a heater I mean somebody to make the audience dislike them despite what they're doing, if you don't put somebody like that with them, they're going to get over. And that's why they had to pair him eventually with a Fonzie character and align him with the WWF, because Sabu was doing things nobody else was doing. Sabu was doing things that potentially nobody else could do, and certainly nobody else was willing to do. And that kind of stuff is always going to leave a mark.
Yeah, real briefly, his no-rope barbed wire match with Terry Funk. You've seen this, yes?
Oh, yeah, Born to be Wired.
That's one of the most... It's an odd match in that there's only a few things that actually seem to happen before they wind up just tangled in this ball of barbed wire on the floor, and they desperately count a pinfall because they have to now cut them out of the wire before somebody gets strangled by it or it nicks a major blood vessel. But I mean, famously, Sabu tears his bicep open on a spot in a corner. He jumps off the corner to do a flying leg attack type scenario. And as he hits, Terry rolls out of the way, if memory serves. He hits the corner, comes down, and just catches the inside of his bicep on one of the barbs. And in his own words, and if you want to hear his recollection of this, if you can find, I believe it was Jeremy Borash who did the documentary Forever Hardcore.
Forever Hardcore, yeah.
Where Sabu speaks about this. He tore it open so deep it didn't actually bleed. And that's a legitimate thing, everybody. If you're not unfamiliar with that particular... with how that happens, it sounds crazy like it's too cold to snow, but it's very, very true. You can cut yourself so badly and so deeply that it doesn't actually bleed all that much. And then he tapes it up with athletic tape. I mean, of course the guy was going to wind up getting over if he's doing stuff like that. But anyway, that match with Terry Funk, that's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. And I've seen some Japan stuff that's crazy. But, I mean, just the reality of those two guys with legitimate barbed wire. This was not safetied up barbed wire. Actual barbed wire. Going out there and, I mean, somebody could have died. That's not an exaggeration in this particular case.
Think if you get your throat caught on that barbed wire instead of your bicep. Which
was very possible given the move he did into it. Or the fact that he wraps his leg in barbed wire to do the leg drop onto Terry Funk on the outside. Which could easily, I mean, there's a couple of major blood vessels that get kind of close to the surface, depending on where you are in your leg. And the other thing that, again, Terry Funk also talks about, at the end there, being in that ball of barbed wire was probably the most painful thing. And I think it was Terry who said there was a time in that when he couldn't actually breathe. Something had caught around his throat and he couldn't breathe, and they had to come in with wire cutters and cut the two of them out of that ball that was entangling them together. And well, wasn't there a moratorium on barbed wire matches for a while? I mean, not the use of barbed wire, obviously, but the full-on no-rope barbed wire match.
Yeah, it was one of those things where when it came out and was released on video, it was one of the things you had to see. And then you saw it and you felt uncomfortable watching it. And it's something that somebody doesn't believe you about when you tell them, and you have to show them, and you don't make it through the whole thing because it bothers you that much. That's what that match is for me.
I've only seen, to the best of my knowledge, what amounts to a highlight version of it. I don't think I've ever seen the whole thing start to finish. I mean, I imagine that the reaction that some people have to that is another match that elicits kind of a similar emotional and uncomfortable reaction would be the Hell in a Cell match between Mankind and The Undertaker, where it's just a little uncomfortable to watch a human being go through that much, especially when you know that, again, very little of that was actually gimmicked up to be protected.
Yeah, just a guy going so far over that line to just entertain and keep himself going over, and Sabu, just like Foley, legitimately partly insane with the things he was willing to do. And even though he started off as a heel, there was no way that people were going to be able to boo him for doing the things he did.
Well, he taped up his jaw during a what do they call it? A Stairway to Hell match type thing? It's just a ladder match.
A Stairway to Hell match with the Sandman. He taped up his jaw.
Yeah. How do you not cheer that? I mean,
He
especially
crazy
with
glued
the
Cuts
audience.
shut.
Yeah, it's insanity. And with that crowd, he was gonna, like you said, he was gonna wind up getting over. All right. Speaking of Fonzie, I most associate Bill Alfonso for some reason with Rob Van Dam. Now, I forget which interview it was that Paul Heyman did recently. It was either his appearance on Steve Austin's podcast or an interview he did with Ariel Helwani, and I can't remember which one. Talking about Rob Van Dam, he said that Rob Van Dam's biggest asset in ECW was the fact that he was a completely unique, completely different character and had a very different kind of in-ring presentation. And in the World Wrestling Federation, the biggest marks against Rob Van Dam were that he was a completely unique character with a different perspective, with a unique ring presentation. Is that do you think that's an accurate statement?
I do. And Rob, again, a guy who developed his own athletic style, mixing, martial arts with high flying, and a guy not having consistently great matches at the time because he didn't really have that grounding yet, but a guy who was doing the most unique stuff you ever saw, and initially didn't have Fonzie. He was just an arrogant kind of,
California stoner.
Yeah, and I'm better than you, even before the stoner aspect came into play, and drew heat because he was, refusing to shake hands with Sabu, disrespecting him openly, and the smart crowd kind of, got on that stuff. But he was Rob. He was different, and he didn't care. And there are people who take to that, especially an older, edgier audience. So how do you get them to boo? Again, the common denominator in that equation is Fonzie. And Fonzie drew heat, and eventually when they came up with the Mr. Monday Night gimmick, that Rob was really there for WWE, that's when people were going to boo him, and that's what it took. And it didn't last as long as I think Paul thought it would, because Rob was just so different and so innovative with the things he were doing that people, even in matches with an uber babyface to the ECW crowd like Jerry Lynn, Rob was still getting more cheers.
Well, how can you not cheer a guy? And again, if you watch Rob Van Dam kind of during that run in ECW in his prime, athletically and from a presentation standpoint, there's almost no one who did it better. I mean, the things he was going to do. I mean, the fact that he could jump coast to coast for the Van Terminator, he would kick a chair into your face, the split-legged moonsault. I mean, nowadays it's mostly that he hasn't updated anything he does in the last decade, and that I believe that to be a negative, for the record. But at the time, everything he was doing was different, and it was executed crisply. And that audience that was so obsessed kind of with the in-ring presentation as much as everything else, they were eventually going to start cheering a guy who was as gifted in the ring as Van Dam was. I mean, his run as ECW television champion that lasted over a year, I mean, another kind of Paul Heyman line was, even when Rob Van Dam was with Bill Alfonso, he was booed until he got in the ring, and then he was cheered, and then after the match he was booed again. And that's just kind of the way his character went for a while. And, I mean, just an interesting character. Van Dam's career is interesting in that he's another guy who, once he got to the World Wrestling Federation, he was the only guy from the ECW Invasion once they merged with WCW and became the Alliance from the Invasion storyline that much more has been said and written about and talked about than I'm going to get into here. But he was the only guy who seemed to they actually kind of wanted to get behind. He was inserted into, main events with Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was going one-on-one with The Rock. He was the only one from that group that it seemed like behind the scenes, the company was like, okay, we can kind of get behind this guy. Was it just the fact that he enjoys various borderline illegal substances that kind of held him back, or was it his lack of kind of fundamental wrestling that you need to be on that big stage?
To me, I think Rob goes as far as Rob is willing to go. And Rob doesn't necessarily want to be the guy doing the Iraq trips and all the Make-A-Wish stuff and all the press tours and everything like that a guy who's really committed to wanting to be the top guy like a John Cena is willing to do and puts himself out there to do, because it's a tremendous amount of work. And beyond just being in the ring and, training every day, the load that you take on in doing that to be a legitimate top guy long term is staggering, and most people don't understand it and never will. Rob didn't want to do that. What Rob wanted to do is wrestle because he loved wrestling. He wanted to work in good programs because he felt he had the talent to do so, and he did. But I don't think it ever really mattered to Rob the way it mattered to people for Rob, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think I'm being clear with that, but if I'm not, Rob was so over with so many of us.
If I might throw in a slightly more verbose way of saying that,
yeah.
People wanted Rob Van Dam to be the guy. They wanted that for him much more than he ever wanted it himself.
Exactly. And it's because Rob connected with the audience in a way that very few do.
Yeah, and then sadly he got the chance to be the guy, or to at least maybe make a run at being the guy, and next thing you know, hey, look, pills. Just sad. All right.
Even then, he wasn't going to be long term, I don't think. But
he was never going to replace John Cena for as an example. But the fact that they made him the dual champion, the fact that they were willing to maybe, Edge talks about his first run as champion, which lasted all 3 weeks from New Year's resolution when he cashed in on John Cena after the Elimination Chamber match to losing the title back to John Cena. That was his chance to prove he belonged in that area. And, I mean, the way the WWE is, precious few people even get the chance to prove they belong, much less get anointed to be that guy. And I think Rob had an opportunity there to prove that he belonged in that kind of upper echelon, and then wound up blowing it. I mean, again, he was never going to replace John Cena for a lot of reasons. But if you get an opportunity like that, and he made his choices. I'm certainly not going to say they should have done anything other than what they did. But I think that was his opportunity to prove I can be maybe not the guy, but I can be one of the guys. The last two guys we want to touch on that I think we'd be remiss not to mention before we close up shop here. First of all, Mike Awesome. Now, I forget who said this. It might have been Matthew of Botchamania fame. Mike Awesome and Masato Tanaka had functionally the same match for about 5 years, but damn, it was an awesome match. Now, Mike Awesome, as one of the ECW champions, as a physical athlete, as a physical presentation, I was not deeply enough involved again during the time frame to figure out what would make him a bad guy at the time. So, from someone who was a fan of the times, was his primary heel stuff based on the fact that he wound up leaving for WCW, or was he presented as being a bad guy prior to that? Was his whole presentation maybe that of a large bully who thinks he's better than everyone? Because I'm not familiar with the overall presentation of Mike Awesome.
The eventual departure for WCW as ECW champion really got him permanently vilified to ECW fans. But long before that, the guy was a heel and presented as such. And probably the most definitive I'm a terrible person angle they did with Mike Awesome and Shibumi was one with Spike Dudley, where Spike had an on-screen girlfriend character who was very much female. Spike Dudley, I could almost compare it to if you've ever seen Wayne's World 2, how Garth ends up hooking up with a female Garth. And they did an angle with Mike Awesome where Awesome knocked Spike Dudley's girlfriend's teeth out and proceeded to, pick on Spike, who was standing up for her. And Spike, of course, is, 5'6", 155 pounds, deformed little man that he was in ECW. WWE allowed him to be a little bit more normal, but Awesome, especially in the ECW context, huge, because that was not a place where the majority of the big guys were. So Awesome, who's
even then he was 6'2"? Even then he was he was a pretty big guy anyway.
No, Mike Awesome was 6'6", about 330.
And in ECW, that's a giant.
That is a giant in ECW. And they actually built this to a pay-per-view main event. Granted, obviously, that says a lot about the talent pool available at the time. But, Awesome wound up just absolutely destroying Spike through table after table after table. Awesome bomb after awesome bomb after awesome bomb. And really, Mike Awesome was brought in because ECW had lost its agreement with Sid Vicious, who had a heel manager by the name of Jeff Jones, who was doing a gimmick as Judge Jeff Jones, a disgraced referee, and he would come out and say, "You're guilty," and Sid would then come out and destroy whomever happened to be in the ring at the time.
Good old Sid Justice.
Yeah, and basically they replaced him with the best guy they could get, who happened to be Jeff Jones. And so Jeff was a much lesser version of Bill Alfonso, to put it mildly, and he was Mike's heater. And eventually they got to a point where they didn't really need him with Mike Awesome. He was just there, and Awesome was just, he just had scenery, and that was it. But Mike was just portrayed as the domineering giant of ECW, and rightly so, because he was much bigger than everybody else there, and he was, a powerful guy who could do whatever he wanted. And he, I always think he never got his due as an in-ring performer, because I thought he was really very, very good, and ECW at least allowed him to be a top guy somewhere and didn't put him into, that 70s guy gimmick, or call him the fat chick thriller, or do any number of missteps that both the WWE and WCW did with him later.
You'd think it would be easy. I mean, a guy who's 6'6", over 300 pounds, and can do what Mike Awesome could do. To anyone out there who's never seen a match with Mike Awesome, or first of all, his stuff with Masato Tanaka, I jokingly said, they had the same match over and over again. There's some truth to that. By the same token, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But look up just what he's able to do in the ring, and the fact that neither WCW or Vince McMahon with his big man fetish were able to do anything of any substance with him as a performer. I mean, it's borderline tragic, because when you look at what he could do when he was on, I mean, even his one-night stand match with Masato Tanaka was still so good. And that was their kind of break from their formula from the rest of their matches. But, I mean, even then, being well over, I think it was over 40 at the time, not active, not necessarily as active as you would be if you're on a main stage, like the WWE, for him to still go out there and put on, even on that card, I think hands down the match of the night was Awesome and Tanaka. It speaks so much to what he could have been. He's one of those few guys who, when you talk about legitimate missed opportunities, I think his name needs to be brought into that discussion. I mean, again, a really great performer who, at least for a short time, got a chance to shine, and one of the most agile big men that you'll ever see, with how easily he could hop to the top rope and the distances he could close with his splashes off the top and clotheslines. My dad, who was an old-timer, liked him and used to compare him to an old-timer named Don Leo Jonathan, who was a very big man, a giant of the day at 6'7", was frequently an opponent for Andre because he was one of the only believable opponents you could have for Andre, but was known for incredible agility, and that's who Mike Awesome reminded him of. And, Mike Awesome was indeed awesome to watch, and probably never got his due as a performer. Hey, if nothing else, the fact that he threw one of the members of the ICP off of his bus forever endears him to me.
As it should to everybody.
Everyone says he was reaching out to grab the guy's leg to stop him from falling off. I maintain he was pushing him. That's my story, and
How I
I'm
look
sticking
at
to it. All right, the last guy I want to talk about was not a wrestler, just kind of an on-screen character. During the TNN era of ECW, Cyrus, did they actually call him Cyrus the Virus? Or was that just kind of a nickname that got sprung out of that?
That was a nickname that got sprung out. He was just known as Cyrus, and he was the representative to ECW for the network.
Now, first of all, when dealing with, no professional wrestling fan tends to like the network that their show is on. Minor exception for WCW during the days when they liked Turner for bringing them an alternative, and that was kind of their thing. But even nowadays, you look at there are people in TNA unhappy with Spike TV. Every time the contract's up, there's rumblings about WWE and NBC Universal, and it just seems like fans never like their network representative. When your whole gimmick as a promotion is being anti-establishment, giving the establishment such a obnoxious and profound voice is guaranteed to get heat. And the fact that, if you believe Paul Heyman, and take that with as much industrial salt as you feel necessary, they didn't actually script all that much for him. They actually gave him the notes that the network executives sent them and had him discuss those live on camera. Instead of having to sit down and say, well, what would be a good thing to try and get him heat, we actually had, hey, look at this. I mean, and also, again, the fact that he was not a wrestler, and did he ever get his comeuppance, or was he forever just due to their contract running out and whatnot? Was he forever just kind of the last antagonist that never really got it?
No, they basically did it, and ironically enough, the person who he wound up getting into that physical confrontation with was Joel Gertner, the longtime manager of the Dudleys, known for his how should we say crude ring introductions, laced with not so subtle sexual innuendos. So of course, when you have a guy who says that, and you have a network liaison who's trying to censor everything that you do and coming out at various points during the show and telling you the network does not approve of this, we at the network are really into this, it made for a brilliant character, and it made for a brilliant, opposition to him, where Gertner, who kind of didn't have a direction at that point because of the Dudley Boys bolting for the WWF, as it was known at the time, and leaving Joel without anybody to manage or anything, it made sense to have Joel come in that regard and go at it with Cyrus. And Joel had kind of become Joey Styles as a broadcast partner unofficially at that point, and then when the angle with the network ran its course with Cyrus as their liaison, he eventually took over color commentary duties as well, but he would still make subtle hints to, the network, would love this, or things of that nature. And he was fairly good. I think Don Callis was a good performer who just rubbed the wrong people the wrong way, and that's why we didn't see more of him. But he, in that role, he just milked it for all it was worth. And when you have Paul Heyman cutting promos against TNN on TNN's airtime, giving one of those Paul Heyman noted motivational speeches, but instead of doing it to the locker room and telling them we're fighting against WCW and WWE because of this, this, and this, he's telling the ECW fan base to rally against the network they're on. And then when you rile them up and you have a physical representation of who they're supposed to be mad at, that guy's going to generate heat unless he's absolutely terrible. And Don Callis was, I think, a really good for that role, because he could get you mad at him without overplaying it and really keeping that air of us versus them going. Because that's what ECW is built on more than anything, us versus them.
Yeah. He had a great look, too, didn't he? He had kind of the black suits. Didn't he have long hair, I seem to recall?
He did. He had the not necessarily slicked back, but his hair was always pushed back and pinned back and combed back into a long hairstyle, where he looked like, the typical yuppie record executive type is the best way I can describe it. The older guys who keep long hair to try to maintain some semblance of, oh, hey, look, I'm hip, I've got a ponytail,
Ironically enough, a look used by Paul Heyman for far too long.
Ironically enough.
Who'd have thought, right? Life imitating art. All right, I think unless there was someone else that you wanted to talk about, I think that's everybody that I wanted to hit as far as the promotion went.
Yeah, I mean, a promotion that lasted 8 years in reality time, and we were able to talk about that many heels as significant in their existence, is a pretty good indicator of covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, again, like you mentioned, promotion in its, as we know it today, I mean, Eastern Championship Wrestling, the original ECW, had a bit more of a track record. Jimmy Snuka was their first champion, if memory serves. But
he was.
But the ECW that changed the face of professional wrestling, 8 years, and had some great stuff come out of that. I mean, there was some not so great stuff as well. I mean, the Rotten Brothers were nothing to write home about.
You mean Justin Credible's ascension to the top of the card as world champion?
I choose to forget that in a lot of ways. Because, really, the guy with the yellow jockstrap from WWF is now your champion. This is one of those cases where you have to distance yourself from what the guy was on another program before you try and make him your guy. Especially if you're going to especially if you don't even want to give Tommy Dreamer a shot to run with the ball. Sandman, great entrance, involved in some great angles, but I mean, gun to my head, I couldn't name you a good match he was ever in. But that also wasn't what that character was all about.
Yeah, not necessarily a heel, really more remembered as a babyface. Had a heel run to begin with, but nothing really noteworthy other than the blind angle, which has been covered ad nauseum, and not really a despicable thing either on the things we've talked about tonight.
No, the only thing he did as a heel that I really remember was he was the guy who caned Tommy Dreamer. And everything else after, he was, again, more as just a really, for some reason, I will never understand how the Sandman got as over as he did. Not how he got over. I understand that. It was a great presentation of just kind of being the everyman. I do not understand how he got as over as he did. That's forever a head scratcher for me. And I'm not trying to insult the guy here. That's just as far as his career.
People like a tough guy looking for a fight with a beer in one hand, a smoke in his mouth, ready to just exchange left hands and just hit somebody.
Hey, Steve Austin had a pretty good career based on that logic.
Didn't he?
Yeah, who would have thought? To the point where now he can have a podcast and take swigs of water for the working man.
Now, a Sandman podcast, that I would listen to.
You want to talk about Trainwreck? Only if his son is there to correct everything he gets factually inaccurate.
No,
that's
even
the only
with that,
way I'm
I
listening.
still love it.
All right, but yeah, that's pretty much everyone and everything we wanted to talk about. So, Mr. Mullin, thank you so much for being back on the show. It's been a while. Again, you were here for when we talked about territories in professional wrestling. Need to have you back in the near future for something. Thank you for coming back on.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Robert. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
So, what do you got to plug?
After a hiatus, championship rounds will be coming back for season 2 very shortly. So look forward to that. Myself and Gavin Napier giving you everything you need to know in the world of boxing. I just did an appearance over on From the Cheap Seats with Jason Teasley and Jesse Starcher, our West Virginia friends, on the Casual Heroes. I make an appearance discussing the recent events in the NFL surrounding Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson and the general take on them as far as public perception, how much it's influenced by public perception, and just kind of where things should stand and where they do stand in terms of parenting and what constitutes physical abuse to a child. It was an interesting discussion, not necessarily your average sports discussion. The guys, they recorded the rest of the show, and as usual, I love to hear those guys. And actually, Jason wrote a great piece, too, that I'll plug over on the Casual Heroes, starting off his NFL roundups for the year. A lot of fun to read, really well written, so check that out if you have time. And, again, if you haven't heard me on the Territories edition of Everybody Loves a Bad Guy or the Rowdy Roddy Piper edition of Everybody Loves a Bad Guy, by all means, check those out. I don't mind getting an extra listen or two.
Hey, I'll take it any way I can get it. I'm trying to build a brand here, and with my numbers, every listen makes a difference. So everybody out there, please go back, listen to any of these if they strike your fancy. Tell your friends if you find a show that you think they'd like. We appreciate all of that. All right, my plugs, and I'll be brief. If you're going to be awake in quite a few hours, but tonight, starting at 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, UFC Fight Night 52, headlined by Mark Hunt and Roy Nelson, and boy howdy am I excited for that fight. No sarcasm. I want to see those two guys punch each other in the face. I don't want to see it go more than...
That's legitimately one of 3 fights I can love in MMA.
I don't want to see this go more than 8 minutes for the obvious reason, including the fact that Roy Nelson is apparently back up around 260 pounds. That guy took his career just a little bit seriously. Just a thought. But I will have live coverage over in the MMA zone at 411mania.com. So if you're interested, stop by, say hello. There might be a chicken. Papa Shango might make an appearance. You never know. So be on the lookout for that. This coming Sunday every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, the 411 Ground and Pound radio show for all of the MMA fans. Myself, usually Jeff Harris, Larry Zonk has made a couple of appearances. Talking about everything in the world of mixed martial arts. We'll be reviewing Fight Night 52 and previewing UFC 178. Much as I love Demetrius Johnson, I have to call this another no buys, even though I love the guy. One of my favorite fighters. So we'll be previewing that. And again, we'll talk about all the other stuff in the world of mixed martial arts. We might get into Thiago Silva being re-released. Why'd you hire him back in the first?
I would have hired him back. But that's because
really?
I think he's interesting and fun. And if you put him against the right opponent and you see him win, it's awesome.
All right. And we might talk
I want
about
Thiago
Anthony
Silva to get a shot at the Jones-Cormier-Gustafsson Ultimate Winner. That's what I want.
Yeah, because he wouldn't get killed by any of them.
No, and he's already been beaten pretty thoroughly by Gustafsson, so.
He needs that. Cormier would ragdoll him. I kind of want to see that just to watch him get ragdolled by Dan Cormier. All right. We might talk about Anthony Johnson being suspended for being stupid. So anyway, MMA, Sunday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern, every week. Good times. feel free to mute the WWE Night of Champions pay-per-view and listen to us, because the commentary is awful and there's only one match on that entire card actually worth watching. And
Is there any other match but that one? I haven't seen any promoted.
Let's see, the Usos and the Dusts have a match for the titles, I believe. Hopefully the Dusts get the belts, because the Usos a little tired in their current role. Sheamus and Cesaro are going to fight for the U.S. title, and if they don't put it on Cesaro, I will be shocked, because Sheamus is just another guy, and Cesaro might actually elevate the belt. Ziggler and Miz, I think, in some version, are having a match that no one cares about, because I don't care for either of them. You can see the rematch of Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. They gave away the match last Monday, but we're getting the rematch of a match that had no outside interference and had a clean finish for Roman Reigns. Orton and Jericho are having a match that no one cares about, because Chris Jericho's leaving and no one cares about Randy Orton. And then Cena and Lesnar. Only Cena and Lesnar matters, and even then, only if Brock Lesnar once again demolishes John Cena. So, if none of that appeals to you, you can listen to the 411 Ground and Pound radio show, and you can be more entertained by me and Jeff Harris. I'll just throw that out there. All right, be sure to check out all the great shows here on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. Every Tuesday, you have the Whiskey Rebellion, Mark Radulich, Gavin Napier, occasionally Chris Evans, occasionally Pat Mullin, occasionally me. It's kind of a revolving thing if something comes up that we want to talk about. It's news of the day, including an ending bit where Gavin talks about a famous conspiracy theory. Their last one was all dedicated to, did we fake the moon landing? I refer you to Mythbusters, gentlemen. That's all I'll say on the subject. Every Wednesday from the Cheap Seats, Jason Teasley, Jesse Starcher, Robert Cooper, talking sports, all kinds of fun stuff there. Pat mentioned the show he was on. It's a good show. It's not your typical sports podcast. So give it a listen, see if you like it. This coming Thursday, I am going on the long road to ruin to talk about the Matrix trilogy. So if you're a fan of that trilogy and Keanu Reeves, and why wouldn't you be? The man has the face of a plank and about as much charisma. Be on the lookout for that. The last episode of the Metal Hammer of Doom was Ailstorm, and who doesn't love pirate metal? If you don't, there's something wrong with you. I maintain that. And then my show every Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern next week, I will be talking WCW with probably a diehard WCW fan. I might try and get Gavin Napier back on here because I know he falls into that category. Or anyone else if they're willing to volunteer. This is still first come, first serve for a lot of this. I don't have guests in mind for some of these. So be on the lookout for that next week, and in the near future, I believe Jesse Starcher will be starting his comic-centric podcast on Monday. So if it's not this week, it's next week, I think. So be on the lookout for that as well. You can follow us, Blog Talk, iTunes, Stitcher. Type Radulich into your search engine. We'll come up. Subscribe, rate, follow. Give us reviews. We appreciate that as well. Thank you also very much for being here. That's going to wrap us up this evening. So for the East Coast Magnet, the pugilistic pontiff and boxing aficionado Pat Mullin, and yes, he does have all those titles. I believe they're in the form of degrees. He has not yet received a belt. Pat Mullin, I'm Robert Winfree, reminding you all that without a good bad guy, your hero is just a crazy guy in tights. I'll see you next week. Until then, once again, Tony Montana. Good night, everybody.
So say good night to the bad guy.